pleased to introduce Andrea Bernstein, a veteran journalist at the New York Observer and WNYC, and a fellow podcaster. She has a podcast called Trump Inc. And the reason we're here today is she has a brand new book. It's called American Oligarchs, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power, which was recently published by W.W. Norton and which you can purchase at any independent bookstore or Amazon if you're that kind of person. Welcome, Andrea.
Great to be here with you and with everyone.
Okay, it's fun to have you. Before we begin, I want to say a brief word to our audience about how we're going to proceed and how our audience can participate in this webinar. First, Andrea and I are going to have a short conversation about the book, which I read in the last 5 or 6 days, and it is a terrific read. And then Andrea is going to do a reading. And then you, the audience, will be able to come in on a Q&A, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and put your question in. So when the Q&A is open, just start to click on that, and you can ask Andrea any question you want. I may try and group some of them together if they're similar. So Andrea, let's get started. First of all, congratulations on the book. What an achievement.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were sort of writing books at the same time. I've got one coming out in July, and reading your book made me realize how much historians like me depend on people like you to do the hard work of digging out the facts about people who are writing contemporary history now. I'm going to jump right in. Andrea, I think you and Ilya Maritz broke the story about Trump campaign advisor Paul Manafort's shady real estate investments almost 3 years ago today. A story that cracked open a major series of investigations against not just Manafort and other people who were associated with Trump, but the president himself. But you and others, I'm thinking of Wayne Barrett, who makes an appearance in the book from time to time and was a colleague of yours. All of you have been reporting the story for a long time. So tell us, what is it that we didn't know about Trump when he was running for president?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's a, that is an endeavor that took me sort of years to piece together and over 400 pages to put together. I mean, I think that let me just sort of back up a moment and sort of talk about my own experience. So I have been covering politics and government corruption for about 25 years. And what happened when we began to cover the Paul Manafort story, and I think part of the answer to your question is Trump seemed to be losing so badly that I don't think that the sort of investigative arms geared up into covering his campaign of various news outlets. However, I will say that there was a lot of tremendous work during the campaign, and there were sort of a lot of reasons. I don't necessarily think it's because people didn't know things, and I think that this is a lesson that we keep learning. People know an awful lot about Trump, and almost half the country really likes him. So it's not a question of not knowing so much as a question of sort of people sort of picking and choosing their facts, which is something I spent a lot of time in the book talking about. But so back to Paul Manafort. I had covered politics, basically, and I was covering the 2016 campaign, and I was mostly working on covering Hillary Clinton's race because she'd been the senator from New York, and I'd covered her extensively since she started running for office here back in 1999. And when Trump won, like a lot of people, I asked myself, well, what am I going to do now? And it became clear to me that Trump had really emerged from a world that I knew a lot about and had a really sort of on-the-ground perspective that a lot of people didn't, who covered the White House or covered national politics. And I felt almost a sense of obligation to cover it at that time. So we decided, okay, we're going to start with Trump Tower. And we got we decided, okay, we want to know who lives in this building. And mostly the people who own the units in Trump Tower are shell companies.
Right.
So we began to put together a grid and a Google document and aggregate all the information we could find about each of the owners of each of the units. And we started about floor 29, I think, is where the residential units start. And we went up and we got up to 43G. And 43G was Paul Manafort's apartment. And it had been owned by a limited liability company called John Hanna LLC. And we were trying to figure out, well, who is John Hanna? There is a real John Hanna who was a former aide to Vice President Dick Cheney. And we thought, oh, perhaps there's some connection. But in fact, no, we reached the real John Hanna and he was like, I don't know why my name is on that limited liability company. And then we noticed this very strange pattern of financing. So the apartments were bought with all cash, which means no loans. That one, in the case of that one, I think it was 2005, 2006. And then in this case, a decade later, Manafort transferred the property into his own name and then took out a big loan against it. And we thought to ourselves, okay, let's see what other property he owns. So we looked him up in the land records online. And we found on Union Street in Brooklyn, not far from where I live, a brownstone with an almost identical financing pattern. It had been purchased with cash under a shell company, in that case, MC Brooklyn Limited Liability Company. Later on, transferred into a loan, and then it transferred into Paul Manafort's name, and then a loan was taken out against it. And so what we learned, what we noticed was that the loan he had taken out was for $7 million. And since I live in Brooklyn and I have some experience with getting home loans in Brooklyn, I thought that is a really large loan for a 4-story brownstone in Brooklyn. So I went over to look at the building, and which is about a 10-minute bike ride from my house. And it looked like an ordinary home. And what I didn't know at the time, even though I had covered corruption and the movement of money into politics, was that this house wasn't actually a home. It was a physical manifestation of an international money laundering scheme in which oligarchic wealth had been moved from Ukraine to the United States. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea that that had been happening. And uncovering that and tracing the story of how we got to the moment became the project of this book.
Well, and I actually remember reading a news squib about the broadcast that you did about this. And I was up in Massachusetts at the time, and I was so proud that WNYC had broken the story. Yeah. It's old school journalism. And you really tell the book as an old school journalist would, like, here are all the things you need to know. Here's the story, but here's how we back up the story. And as this expanded, it becomes a story about an American oligarchy. And part of what's interesting to me is, of course, Trump positions himself as America first, a nationalist, blah, blah, blah. He's totally embedded in the movement of global capital, as are the Kushners. And the word you use in the title, oligarch, is not normally used to describe American politicians. And I wonder if you could just pause a minute, tell our audience what that word means and what it means that two powerful American families, the Trumps and the Kushners, qualify to be called oligarchs.
Well, I think we're still learning and understanding what it means in the context of American democracy. So we mostly understand oligarchs as, for example, in Russia. The oligarchs were people who, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were able to essentially capitalize on the denationalization of industries, particularly having to do with energy and mineral wealth. So these people became the oligarchs. They became the place where wealth was concentrated. But in Russia, of course, the oligarchs have a different relationship with the government than they do in the United States, because basically in Russia, you're only allowed to become wealthy if you essentially pay fealty to the government and to the president. I think the entire country got a glimpse during the Ukraine impeachment hearings of another way that oligarchs were asserting their will. And one of the things that, just to sort of back up to Paul Manafort, who's sort of a kind of a central side character in the book, is he eventually, of course, and we didn't know at the time we did the story, when we wrote, this really looks like money laundering. We didn't know about Viktor Yanukovych, the corrupt former president of Ukraine, and how he had wired money into this Brooklyn brownstone through Cyprus. And eventually Paul Manafort was put on trial. He's now serving time in prison. During his trial, some of the witnesses were asked, well, where did the money come from to pay for Paul Manafort's work in Ukraine, his political work? And the answer was, it came from the oligarchs. And that is the system in Ukraine, which is that the oligarchs pay for the politics. They just pay the political consultants outright to get the politicians who are going to enable them to become rich. And this is the kind of system that we've been steadily moving towards in this country. And one of the things I really wanted to point out is that sort of Trump, while he is really unique, he also is the product of the system and of a steady dismantling over the last half century, really, of both our system of taxation and campaign finance laws, which regulate the flow of money into politics. So our system is without doubt becoming more oligarchic. And one of the questions that hangs in the balance of the Trump presidency is, if we are going to end up being like Ukraine, if we are going to end up being like Russia, and where we are going after this moment in history.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pick up on that, because throughout the book, you describe this way of doing business that is both legal and illegal. And there's this sort of gray area between what is legal and what is illegal that actually the Trumps and the Kushners are moving in and out of all the time from both directions. We see loans that are never paid back, tax laws that are exploited, the arbitrary reevaluation of properties to take best advantage of them, depending on what they're being used for, whether they're being taxed or whether their loans being taken out. But what I really noticed in the book is that the Trumps and the Kushners, even though they're the stars of the show here, your book really tells a bigger story about money, politics, and most importantly, the personal favors and networks that the ultra-rich use to pursue their interests in the United States. And so I just want to follow up on what you were talking about and ask you this question. President Trump's financial shenanigans aren't really specific to him, are they?
Well, it's a complicated question, because, one of the things that I realized in the course of writing the book that I didn't really understand when I started, because when I understood, I knew that Trump, despite what he says, wasn't actually one of the wealthiest men in America. Not when you compare him to, say, the Kochs or the DeVos family or the Olins or these extremely wealthy families that, or the Scaife, that play this role in our political system of financing elections and financing think tanks and financing lawsuits that are going to dismantle campaign finance laws. And that's something that Jane Mayer in her book, Dark Money, really exposes and lays bare, is how that system worked. And I knew that Trump wasn't in that league. He didn't have that kind of money, and he didn't really play that kind of game. Mm-hmm. And what I came to learn is that the more I thought about it, is that Trump also broke the system, though not in the way that, say, the Koch brothers have done. He broke the system by practicing, as did his father before him, or sort of acting as if New York government was an oligarchic form of government, and acting as if the elected officials in New York, if he were to give them something, would owe him something. A very kind of transactional oligarchic model, which he was quite upfront about. At one point in the 2016 campaign, he said, I give to politicians and I give to everybody. And then 2 years later, when I call them up and I want something from them, they are there for me. So that was his understanding. And I also heard it from political leaders in New York. Now, I mean, over the course of the decades, I've called up many people who've worked with politicians and their donors and politicians. And I say, do you know why so-and-so gave you money? And normally they say, well, because they like what I'm doing or how I'm helping the people of New York or New Jersey. In the case of Donald Trump, when I called former high-level state officials and I said, do you know why he gave you this money? They said, oh, yes, I know, because he called me and told me. He said, I gave you $10,000. Where's my permit? Where's my tax abatement? Where's my package? And over the course of the decades, by practicing in this way, the Trump family normalized a system where you would pay an official a certain portion of your wealth, and in exchange, they would give you a much greater portion or an ability to make much more money back. So in the case of Trump's, Donald Trump, he was particularly famous for getting tax abatements that others couldn't, and aggressively suing and pursuing them until he couldn't get them. His father, Fred Trump before him, was called to the US Senate Banking Committee because of what we now see as a really long-time Trump family practice of when you have to pay a tax assessment, you value your property very low, but then when you want to get a bank loan, you value it very high. And they have really, really, really managed to play the game. And one of the things that I spend a long time in the book looking at is how Trump avoids legal consequences, which obviously, as we have seen, he continues to do until this day. And in fact, next month, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a case about whether Donald Trump's business can even be investigated by prosecutors while he's president of the United States.
Right. And, you point to a number of things. I mean, I think looking at this on a very local level is very interesting. It's telling a story about New York, but it's also telling a story about the rollback of regulation, the tax loopholes that have been built into our structure. And throughout the book, there are these moments where Trump gets caught or the Kushners get caught, and it's like, oh, yes, and then they paid a big fine. So that paying a big fine is part of the cost of doing business, but you sort of keep on going as you've been going. Some of the tax loopholes are completely and totally legal for passing down money intergenerationally. So it seems to me, in a way, you're talking about a much bigger problem, which is how our economy is organized, and looking at it at the particular moment we're in, why, in fact, it's so vulnerable. Because this shell game around real estate sort of creates opportunities for the economy to implode.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's the broader, there's been much said and written about widening income inequality in the United States, and we know about this. And one of the things that I think is little understood is how the framers of the Constitution were very worried about economic inequality because they saw that as something that would lead to corruption and potentially to oligarchy. They were directly concerned about that. They were as concerned about corruption as a threat to the then nascent democracy as they were that war would be something that would disrupt the system. And, the system, there have been many points in American history. I mean, the Gilded Age comes to mind when there's also been vast income inequality. I think the difference between those moments and our current moment, or sort of big question about our current moment, is that in the past, we sort of got to the brink of oligarchy, but then the country pulled back in various ways. So there were reforms of the progressive era, there was more taxation, and there was more democracy.
Right.
And we are in one of those periods in history where there's been less and less taxation, basically since the 1980s, and less democracy in the sense that there is more corporate influence in elections, and also there is the same people who are sort of funding the efforts to allow more money to flow into elections are allowing money to flow into systems that make it much harder to vote. So that is sort of the current state, and that is sort of what Donald Trump walked into as president and the situation he's been in as president. It's worth saying about the Kushner family, as most people know, Jared Kushner's father actually did get caught and went to prison for campaign finance violations in a rather spectacularly tawdry case, as it turned out, in which he was being investigated, learned he was being investigated, thought his siblings were conspiring against him, and hired a sex worker to entrap his brother-in-law because he thought that would somehow prevent him from being prosecuted. He ended up being prosecuted or pleading guilty to witness tampering, campaign finance laws, and violating tax laws because he was using corporate money for private purposes, including political contributions. So Charles Kushner did get caught. That case was brought in 2004. And there's a real question about whether under our current system, if somebody did those same things, they would be prosecuted because of all of the ways that laws have made it easier both to give money and to avoid paying taxes.
Right. Well, and you detail in your book all of the ways that Kushner gave money, that, Jared, when he was, a teenager, was giving $40,000 to a politician, and when he was at Harvard, money was being given in his name and so on. But there's another story here too about the Kushners, which is an immigrant story, a very personal story that is sometimes deployed to their advantage, but is part of the real history of Jews in America. And whereas Trump's immigrant story is rather standard, guy comes from Germany, builds a real estate empire, comes from nothing. The Kushners are a different story, and their survival in Poland during World War II required a kind of ruthlessness and resilience that I think really is a theme of the book. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, the Kushner's story was a really extraordinary story. Jared Kushner's grandmother, Ray Kushner, grew up sort of upper middle class in the town of Nowogrodzic, which was in northeast Poland. And there were tens of thousands of Jews in the area. His father-in-law, his grandfather, Yessel Berkowitz, was much poorer, but also grew up near the area. And one of the things that's extraordinary is that, so Jared Kushner's grandmother left several oral histories of her Holocaust experience. And I also went and researched all of the other testimonies of everybody that I could find that had survived from the town that she was in, as well as other documentary accounts. And they kept telling themselves as the Nazis marched in that things were very bad, but they couldn't possibly get worse. So for a while, the Jews were required to wear yellow stars and they couldn't walk on the sidewalks, but they thought life isn't so bad. We can still work, we can still go about our lives. And slowly the noose tightened. And one cold December day, all the Jews, thousands of them, were rounded up and brought to the courthouse. And the Nazis said, you go to the left and you go to the right, and one way was to live and one way was to die. And at one point, Jared Kushner's great-grandmother said to her two daughters, one of you run, so one of you might live. And the daughter that ran and left the line for the trucks actually ended up getting caught and sent to the mass graves. And the rest of them, the Nazis called out at one point, is anybody a furrier? Because they needed people to make hats and coats for the German army as it was marching into Moscow. So they stepped forward, they said, we are furriers, and they were saved. And there were this extraordinary series of stories about how Jared Kushner's grandmother was able to escape what looked like certain death. Her mother was murdered by the Nazis, her sister, eventually her brother. The area had gone from thousands, tens of thousands of Jews to a few hundred, but in the summer of 1943. And they knew if they did not escape the ghetto, they would be, that if they did not escape the ghetto, they were going to be murdered. So they built a tunnel. They secretly, during the night, dug out bags of dirt. They hid them in the walls and under the beds so that the Nazis wouldn't know what they were doing. The tunnel was about 2 football fields in length and about 60 centimeters wide. And one extremely rainy night on the eve of the high holidays, they crawled out. And most of them got out alive. Now, some of them ran in the wrong direction and were later captured by the Nazis. But Jared Kushner's grandmother, Ray Kushner, made it out, made her way to the forest where a band of Jewish partisans was sheltering Jews, and lived for the rest of the war. After the war, she and her family were posed as Greeks and took a train to Czechoslovakia, found their way to Budapest. She met up with Yossel Berkowitz, and then they ended up sort of walking over borders and illegally circumventing border guards, and made it to a refugee camp, a displaced persons camp in Italy, and they were stuck there because so we've just passed the 75th anniversary of Auschwitz. And even with what the US knew in the late 40s about what had happened in the Holocaust, it was still almost impossible to get a visa. They were stateless and they were stuck. And they hit upon the idea, Jared Kushner's grandfather and his grandmother, that if Jared Kushner's grandfather posed as his own father-in-law's son, it would be easier for them to emigrate as a unit. So that's what he did. He changed his name from Yossel Berkowitz to Joe Kushner. They were helped out by the Hebrew Immigration Society. And one of the things that I found in the course of this was their case file from that era. And they arrived in New York with $2 in their pockets. Jared Kushner's grandfather, Joe Kushner, had carpentry skills, and he was able to get work as a carpenter. And he was a very hard worker, a frugal man. They saved up some money and they began to buy land in New Jersey. And this was a tremendously auspicious time to build homes in New Jersey because the Interstate Highway Act was about to be passed. There were mortgage incentives for people to buy homes. There were a lot of federal programs and federal money encouraging the construction of homes in suburbia. And that's how the Kushner family really came from nothing to build up their family fortune. It was moxie, certainly, but also a big dose of government help.
Yeah. And just tremendous resilience. I mean, it's a window into how people left behind a sort of horrifying story and the death of their whole family to really start anew. So Andrea, you're going to do a reading for us, and it's from the beginning of the book. It's going to allow you to tell us a little more of this immigrant story. The three people who really started it all, Friedrich Trump and Josephine Ray Kushner. So I'm going to turn it over to you to do a little reading from the book.
I'm going to do a little reading from the book, and it's from the introduction, but there is also a prologue in the book, which is about Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's wedding. So I encourage people to get the book and read it from the beginning. In 1885, when Friedrich Trump arrived in New York Harbor, just months after the Statue of Liberty did the same, America was racing towards the apotheosis of the Gilded Age. In 1860, the total national wealth was $16 billion. By 1900, it was $89 billion. Railroad tracks were barreling across the country, fueled by 180 million acres of government land giveaways. The very rich, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, were getting even richer. By the end of the century, the richest 4,000 families had amassed about as much wealth as the other 11.6 million families combined. Wealth was not only accumulating, it was on conspicuous display, celebrated. The very wealthy built enormous mansions in New York City and Newport, Rhode Island, and the Hudson Valley. They chose Delmonico's restaurant in Lower Manhattan for their extravagantly frivolous parties. One featured an artificial lake with real swans. In at least one home, there was an actual gold toilet. At the same time, the poor in New York City lived in filthy tenements, as famously documented by Jacob Riis, with 30 or more people sharing a single fetid outhouse. 12 adults would sleep in a room 13 feet across. One of 10 infants living in tenements died. If you left the windows open at night, a feral animal might jump in. This period, before the two world wars and the Great Depression, was near the previous high point of global wealth inequality. As the French economist Thomas Piketty wrote in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, 10% of Americans owned 80% of the wealth. But the United States was not the old world. The Gilded Age was not the Belle Époque, its French counterpart. Channeling Honoré de Balzac, Piketty wrote that in Europe, there was simply no way an individual, even working in a well-paid profession like lawyering, could accumulate wealth as fast as inherited capital could. By contrast, in America, with its egalitarian notions, vast tracts of land and growing populations and lower overall wealth, one could still transcend humble origins. With a few years of work, Piketty wrote, the new arrivals were able to close the initial gap between themselves and their wealthier predecessors. This became harder as the 19th century wore on, but especially on the West Coast, where Friedrich Trump made his fortune, social mobility was still possible in 1885. As Piketty has demonstrated, capital had peaked not long before Friedrich died. The catastrophic world wars and the Great Depression equalized wealth by destroying vast swaths of capital. The Trumps suffered too, but the same economic depression that for a while deprived Fred Trump of his real estate trade also triggered his ascent. Spurred by the federal government's New Deal, capital flowed to builders like Fred Trump, who constructed 2,000 federal loan-backed single-family homes between 1935 and 1942, most of them in Brooklyn. By 1946, just after the war ended, the Trump family was once again thriving. This is when Fred Trump's fourth child, Donald John Trump, was born. At the same time Fred Trump was erecting homes far away in Northeast Poland, Ray and Joseph Kushner were losing theirs in unimaginably brutal conditions, first under the Soviets, then under the Nazis. To a large extent, Piketty wrote, it was the chaos of war, with its attendant economic and political shocks, that reduced inequality in the 20th century. There was no gradual consensual, conflict-free evolution towards greater equality. In the 20th century, it was war and not harmonious democratic or economic rationality that erased the past and enabled society to begin anew. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. 1981, the year Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were born, was an inflection point in American history. Ronald Reagan had just become president. Financial and taxation policy in the United States was about to take a dramatic turn in favor of the wealthy, allowing them to roll up assets often untaxed and increasingly unfettered than at any time since the 1920s. According to a study by the economists Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman, between 1980 and 2014, incomes for the top 0.001% of Americans rose by 636%, while income for the bottom 50% stagnated. For the lowest 20%, incomes actually fell. In 1980, the richest Americans earned on average 27 times as much as the bottom half of Americans. By 2014, that ratio was 81-1, a level of income inequality comparable to Burundi and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. By the time Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump in their mid-30s joined the White House staff, it was getting harder and harder in the United States to transcend the social class of one's birth. As described by Matthew Stewart in a 2018 article in The Atlantic, contrary to popular myths, economic mobility in the land of opportunity is not high and it's going down. Imagine yourself on the socioeconomic ladder with one end of a rubber band around your ankle and the other around your parents' rung. The strength of the rubber determines how hard it is for you to escape the rung on which you were born. If your parents are high on the ladder, the band will pull you up should you fall. If they are low, it will drag you down when you start to rise. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump live in the uppermost layer, the crust on the creme brulee. In the year before they became senior White House advisors, the two made at least $82 million in income. The next year, they reported earnings between $29 and $135 million. This is not an illustration of their net worth, but rather the money they were passively earning from their stakes in the Trump Organization, Ivanka Trump's merchandise, and mostly from Jared Kushner's family business, while at the same time working in the White House. Donald Trump ran for office with the slogan, "Drain the swamp," but when he became president, he used the vast financial resources of the donor class to prop up his power. At the end of his first year in office, following their record-breaking donations and acquiescence to his nativist agenda, he passed a law that limited their taxes, and he loosened a myriad of regulations that could have made them earn a little bit less money, a little bit less fast. Even before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the wealthiest families could still pass along a healthy sum to their dependents, up to $11.2 million, free of the 40% estate tax. Under the new law, that number doubled. Wealthy couples could pass on $22.4 million to their heirs, tax-free. 20 years into the 21st century, we live in an age of oligarchs, where the very richest Americans hold vast sway, not only over their elected officials, and by extension the courts, but also over the election process itself. Stop there. By the way, I read the audiobook if people are audiobook fans. I read it.
And audiobooks are a great way to enjoy such a wonderful story. I mean, I hope people's interests are as piqued as mine was when I read this. I want to let our audience in to ask you some questions. If you don't mind, audience, I'm going to read the questions so I can sort of group some of them. And the first one is from Dorothy Snyder, who says, Andrea, we see the president attack journalists every day in his pressers. As an investigative journalist, and particularly one who must be on the Trump-Kushner enemies list, how imperiled do you think the American free press and American journalists are now?
I think it's really, really bad. I mean, I think there's been a few sort of historical trends regarding journalism that are sort of terrible and apart from Donald Trump. And with the ascendancy of digital formats, it's become harder and harder and harder for a journalistic business model to work. So that's something that's been with us for the last 15 years or so. And it means that there's a real decline of investigative journalism and there's a real decline of local newspapers, which is terrible for democracy because accompanying that, we see an erosion in trust in institutions. Right. And it also has muddied people's understanding of how to get reliable information. So you find a lot of people, in 2016, I did a project with high school students where I would go in and talk to them about the election and I would understand how they were processing information. And one of the things that they would tell me is, well, I learned such and such. And I said, did you learn such and such? And they said, I learned it from the internet. So all of that was happening where people don't understand where they're getting information from. There's a decline of actual journalism. And then in comes Trump, who has lied as of the beginning of this month, has made, according to the Washington Post, 18,000 lies or misrepresentations while he's been in the White House, 350 of them on coronavirus alone. So we have a president who spends a lot of time attacking journalists and attacking journalists' credibility to the point where people believe they can't believe anything. And that is terrible. That is terrible. And it's especially terrible given the current national emergency that people feel that they cannot believe officials, because it is the first predicate for being able to solve something like this is you have to have a common understanding of messaging. So there is all of that. And then right now, because of this virus, we're in a tremendously precarious moment where even more news organizations are shutting down and cutting back. And it is not only a very difficult time to practice journalism, just to sort of get answers to the questions and fight for this sort of area of objective truth, which I believe in, but it is materially extremely difficult because the news industry is really hanging on by a thread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to tell our audience, as another incentive to read the book, you have the distinction of actually having been arrested at Donald Trump's request, trying to cover the opening of one of his Atlantic City casinos. Good for you, Andrea.
Well, that wasn't me. That was Wayne Barrett.
Okay.
But Wayne Barrett and I were subsequently arrested at a political fundraiser that Donald Trump attended for New York Republicans. So that happened in the mid-90s. That case was dismissed on a technicality.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a very active commenter named Yanis, but Yanis, I'm going to have to choose one of your comments over the others. And one of the things Yanis is asking is, how is it that the city and state didn't pick up these sort of changing evaluations of these properties as Trump was maneuvering them for tax purposes and loan purposes. And so, how is it that nobody notices this?
Well, I mean, there's a whole industry in New York of people who own. So let me just back up. When you're a real estate developer in New York, the way that you become richer is by being able to extract more value from your property. So that may mean permission to build higher. It might mean not having to comply with certain environmental regulations. And it might mean that your assessment is lowered and you have to pay less taxes. And there is an aggressive industry in New York real estate where people work extremely hard to lower their taxes. So there's a certain amount of sort of, legal graft that's accepted. You can go to a tax commission. You can say that my property is being valued too high. You can make a big argument. About a month ago, we did a whole podcast episode about a number of former New York City tax assessors who had accepted bribes and gone to prison in order to lower people's assessments, saying that they had lowered taxes for the Trump organization. So I commend everybody to that episode of Trump Inc. for hearing more about how the Trump organization, one of the ways they lowered their taxes. It's very hard to make a tax case. It is time consuming. People like Donald Trump are going to hire aggressive legal teams. There's an understanding. There's a question about how difficult it is to make out a criminal case. And I think that is something that Donald Trump and the Trump organization have exploited, that they've been extremely aggressive in all the ways they've tried to lower their taxes. And everybody understands that they will will fight very hard if they are investigative. So it is A, very, very complicated, and B, they know they're going to get a very difficult fight on their hands if they take on the Trump organization. Now, I should say that as a result of a story that we did with ProPublica for our podcast in the fall, New York City and prosecutors here are actually looking at whether there was anything illegal done, because what we know is that the Trump organization on its tax forms said its income was much lower than it did on forms that it submitted to the banks. And both of them require you to swear that you are telling the truth. So there's some question about whether there will be consequences, but it is part of this long, decades-long dance that Donald Trump has played with local elected officials, where he, and one of the things I talk about in the prologue of the book is how he cultivates people who are in law enforcement and makes them his friends. So when the time comes to make the difficult judgment calls, they seem to very consistently go Donald Trump's direction.
Well, and he also seems to be a proponent of, hold your friends close, hold your enemies closer. There's several instances that you detail in the book where somebody who's suing him actually then gets called in and gets hired by the Trump organization.
Right. He's done that on many occasions. He sued people and then he hires them.
Right.
Or the opposing counsels go to work for him.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from someone named G. Kurtz, who notes that Trump seems to have taken this to the next level as president. And the question that G. Kurtz wants to know is, how does Trump get away with all of these emolument violations?
Well, the emoluments cases law is unsettled right now. I mean, I think one of the things that's difficult about the emoluments is that in 220 some odd years of American history, these parts of the Constitution have never been tested in case law. So this is the first time where we have a president actively saying, if I have blocks of hotel rooms rented out to foreign officials, that is not an emolument. That is their position. And there are a number of cases. One of them was thrown out that was brought by members of Congress due to standing, but there are two other ones one in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Virginia that is probably going to make its way up to the Supreme Court. And there was one in New York, which was lost at the district court level, but then it was an appeals court said, no, you can move forward. So these cases are still unsettled. It's just they take a long time. And this is something that Donald Trump has very, very much used to his advantage. And for people who don't know, the emoluments clause of the Constitution essentially says you can't take a gift from a foreign leader. And this goes back to what we were talking about their fear of corruption of the founders. And there was a case where I think it was Benjamin Franklin had accepted a snuff box that Zephyr Teachout, the constitutional lawyer and politician, has written about, where they felt very anxious about this gift because they felt it could compromise. And then who is the allegiance to? Is it to the French government that gave a snuff box, or is it to the American people? And the form of this that we see now is, for example, the government of Saudi Arabia rents out 500 hotel rooms in a Trump hotel. And one of the sort of little lesser noticed facts about the Donald Trump's perfect phone call with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine was that President Zelensky made sure that Trump knew that Zelensky had stayed in one of Trump's hotels. So everybody around the world understands that that is a way to get in good with Trump. And why wouldn't they? Because he's constantly praising people from the White House for staying at his hotel. So the answer is, we don't know what things are, what is going to happen with that. I mean, there are several extremely significant cases that are moving forward. Next week, there's a case moving forward in the entire DC circuit about whether Don McGahn should be required to testify before Congress. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a suite of cases going to the US Supreme Court next month about congressional oversight. But the tactic that Donald Trump has is that he doesn't want to turn over a document. He sues to block that from happening. He loses in the district court. He appeals. He loses in the appeals court. And then he goes to the Supreme Court. All of this takes tremendous amount of time. For example, there was a Trump v. Deutsche Bank is a case where Congress subpoenaed the president a year ago. And Deutsche Bank has not turned over a single document to Congress because it keeps getting stayed. And the Supreme Court won't be making its ruling until June. The problem with that is that these kind of congressional subpoenas only last as long as the Congress. So even if they were to win, they would have a very truncated amount of time to pursue their case. And that's Donald Trump's MO, to fight things legally so aggressively that sometimes he just wins by running out the clock.
Well, and you have to wonder whether this is why his base is so loyal to him, their hatred of the establishment. We have a question from Bruce Fine, who asks, with as much information available to everyone, can you explain why 50% of the people still like Trump? Although, Bruce, I think that's falling.
Well, I mean, I think it's, I think the reasons are complex. I mean, I think one of the reasons is, and as we've been talking about, is things were fundamentally broken in America in the 2016 campaign. And Hillary Clinton's campaign, which I covered, their argument was like, things are broken, but we can fix them through essentially the same ways we've been fixing them now. And Donald Trump said, I understand that things are broken in America, and I am not going to go through the same old ways. I'm going to go through different ways. Mm-hmm. And that is a very, very appealing message to people who are really, really hurting. So he was able to identify and capitalize on this real failure of the American economy to work for most of the American people. So there's that. I mean, there's a number of cases that I talk about in my book where people who have worked for Trump describe, one person, you mentioned people who sue him. He sued a financial analyst for saying something about him on the PBS NewsHour that he didn't like. And then he calls up this gentleman, Abe Wallach, and says, come to my office. And Abe Wallach gets out of the elevator and he sees this sweeping view of Central Park, and there's Donald Trump, and he seems a little risky and very exciting. And he says, why should I stay in my boring old job? I might as well see what it's like to work for Donald Trump. And he does have this gravitational pull. I mean, lots of people watched him on The Apprentice. He has an ability to draw people in. And I think that that is something that is very much at sway here. And one of the interesting things is at the sentencing of Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former personal attorney, his lawyer stood up and said, you can't come down hard on Michael Cohen because he did the same thing as so many Americans. He was swept up in the sort of allure of Donald Trump and went along with these things. And so I think that that is something that we see playing out on a lot of different levels here.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit because we have a number of people asking a question about Jared. Mel actually, I think, encapsulates this question really well. How does Jared reconcile his own family's immigration story of escaping persecution with his father-in-law's heartless xenophobic policies?
You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about how you go from Holocaust survivor grandparents. I mean, and I do want to say that I don't think, I mean, I wouldn't, and I don't think most people would fault the Kushner family for doing what they needed to do to survive and for fudging family relationships in order to be able to have a chance to rebuild for themselves and their children and their grandchildren in the land of opportunity, and create the kind of opportunity for their grandchildren where their grandchild is now literally one of the most powerful people in the United States and America. Mm-hmm. So I think that I asked myself often how you move from them to him. And I think that one of the assumptions that a lot of us have, and that I sort of had unexamined, was a sense of if you've been a victim of history in this horrible way, you're going to be a rational actor when it is your turn. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the trajectory of at least the Jared Kushner branch of the family, now there's other branches of the family that have gone in other directions, but that trajectory is a sense of the way we are going to protect ourselves and our family is by building a wall, by defending ourselves against all comers, by making sure that we put our community first. And that fits with what Donald Trump is saying.
Yep. So we have a couple of questions, which I'm just going to pin together. One from Cecily Chadwick, who asked if you found any connection in your research between oligarchs and white nationalism, which is a great question, Cecily. I hadn't really noticed it, but that's a whole theme that doesn't get played out. And then we have a question from Sherry Cullen, who says she's been watching The Sopranos a lot while she's been home quarantining. And she wants to know what makes an oligarch different from a mob boss. So if you can just sort of pin those two together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, okay, so there's an awful lot there. I'll take the Sopranos first. I mean, I think that if you look at, for example, Russia, you know, I'm not an expert on Russian society, but people like Masha Gessen and others who have studied it, Frank Foer, have talked about how really it is a mafia state where the very rich people use all kinds of tactics, including violent ones, to secure their fortunes. You know, that is not the tradition in the United States that we have seen, where there is sort of overt use of violence by very rich people who are also trying to manipulate the political system. Now, you could argue that voter suppression and making it, you know, difficult to transcend your economic class and all of these things are a form of violence, but I think it's sort of different from, you know, what happens in Russia, which is if you cross the wrong people, you will be murdered. And maybe not even in Russia, but in another country. So I think it's a sort of a different situation. And the question of white nationalism and oligarchy, I didn't really trace that thread. I mean, I have a couple of things to say in the epilogue of my book, and I don't give away too much because I want people to read. And I also want to say that I really did write this book to be read. I wanted to create a narrative that people would want to turn the pages and wouldn't feel like they had to consume it. So if you've enjoyed this talk, please buy my book. It's available on Amazon. It's available from independent bookstores, many of which are delivering to people's homes now. And also, if you've read it, I'm told by my agent to ask people to review it on Amazon or Goodreads so that it bumps up in the algorithm and more people will get a chance to see it. So there's the book plug. In the epilogue to my book, I talk about how the threads of nativism and white nationalism are, that it makes sense that we have a government which sort of values money and values family and also is white nationalist, because there's a sense of us and them, that certain people are the privileged few and everybody else is the them. And that's where you have various threads of nativism and nationalism sort of intersect with this oligarchic model. I will also say that there's been some reporting, which I haven't done, but which I've read just in the last week, about how some very wealthy families, for example, in Michigan, are supporting the protests against the governor there. And that there are questions about the links between right nationalism, money, and coronavirus protests that are sort of bubbling up in the media now.
And we are looking at you, Betsy DeVos and Eric Prince. So I want to pick up on that because we have time for one more question. And it's from Tim T. Do you think the current health crisis at the end of the day will exacerbate the current inequity and corruption, or will it catalyze the process of breaking up and changing the current systemic problems?
I am not sure. I mean, I think we know it has already exacerbated inequality. We've seen it in everything from who can get tests to who has to work and endanger their lives to who is losing the underpinnings of economic support in their lives right now. So there's no question it's exacerbating inequality. It is also fertile ground for corruption. And we're just beginning to see the ways that that can be emerging, but we already are seeing the president from the White House podium favoring certain companies. He has already fired the person who an independent committee wanted to have oversight over Treasury's expenditure. And we know what that means with Donald Trump. He wants to control the oversight. And this comes in the context of an administration that has displayed really unprecedented favoritism towards friends and donors of the president, and has done it openly. I mean, one of the challenges of investigative journalism has been that Trump would make clear that he was favoring his own business and favoring people. So we began to see glimmers of that. I expect we'll see more. Will it catalyze change? I've been wondering that. And I've been wondering about, what I just read, the words of Thomas Piketty, about what happened after the World War, when there was this catastrophic, traumatic experience. It was a catalyst for higher taxation. After the war, for some income levels, the marginal tax rate was over 90%. It just wasn't worth it to make more money. So, and there was Bretton Woods, there were all of these sort of social supports for a more equitable, more international, global society. Are we moving in that direction? I mean, I would like to think so. And I will say, the last word of my book is hope.
Yeah, I noticed that, Andrea. And on that note, our time has come to a close. I want to thank you so much for taking the time with us. You make me want to have my own TV show so that I could have you back over and over again. And audience, here is the book, American Oligarchs, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power by W.W. Norton, 2020. As Andrea is saying, you can get it at your local independent bookstore, but do get it. It's a terrific read. You're just going to love it. And Andrea, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the New School and the department for having me. I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person, but maybe someday soon.
Fun. Well, let's do it again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.